Okay, guys, so we are kind of skipping backwards a little because, of course, we're doing chapter 14 and 15 together. And so we skipped ahead a little to continue talking about the Spanish conquistadors, but now we're going to slide back a little bit and focus on the Portuguese. So, of course, just as a reminder, the Portuguese were the first ones to try to sail around Africa to get to the Spice Islands or the Moluccas. Um, they were doing that for two reasons. They needed to find a water route because it was dangerous for them to travel over land. And sort of they were eliminating the middleman because they would do some trading there in the Middle East. And so if they could get all the way to the Spice Islands themselves, then it would be okay. They could eliminate that trading going on in the Middle East. The second reason that they were sailing around Africa was because eventually they would like to actually settle in Africa. There's goods there. There are some forts that they wanted to set up so that they would have a place to sort of stop along the way for these journeys. So this section is going to focus on the Portuguese settling there in Africa and how they managed to do this. And we'll also focus on what happens when they actually come in contact with the Africans, because as we've already talked about, sort of with the Spanish and the native people in the New World, it wasn't a great interaction. This is not going to be great either. So this is a map that has a whole bunch of stuff on it that you don't need to know, but if you look at it, again, something that I want you guys to focus on, the years, you can see sort of as they're moving down the coast, this is the years that they sort of settled some of these places here. So you can see, here's Portugal right here. And look at all these little forts that they're going to set up along the way. And of course, they're right there along the coast, which we talked about before. So of course, that's the way that this is going to go, is they settled down, they mapped out this side of Africa. The second journey around here actually settles farther. Obviously, they go this way and all the way out to India. And so you can see that this allowed them to really settle these spots on the coast. So for starters, they are going to build these forts in Western Africa. They start out as a place for these explorers as they're heading over here. Because remember, going around Africa originally is to get to the Spice Islands. But this gives them places to stop and get food and clean water. And so these forts that they set up are going to be right here along the coast. They're small. Okay, so this is not like a massive military establishment by any means. There's only a few people there. It's not to go out and attack the Africans. They probably didn't even have enough there to defend it if they got attacked. It's really just a trading spot. It's a spot for them to stop so that those ships could have somewhere to get supplies. So very small, and like I said, sort of a trading post. So they are going to trade some of these items. So I've listed them here. They're going to have muskets, which of course are guns that they were using. Tools, that's definitely going to be helpful. Cloth, so that's what they're trading. And they're actually exchanging those with Africans for gold, ivory, hides, and slaves. So just go back and read that for a second for me. They're trading muskets, tools, and cloth to the Africans in exchange for gold, ivory, hides, and slaves. So this is where we are going to really see sort of the beginning of the slave trade that eventually is going to turn into the international slave trade, because they will, of course, be collecting Africans from Africa and taking them across the Atlantic to the New World. So this is the beginning of that. It's kind of important that we point out here that the Africans were actually an active part in this slave trade, because this is something that gets like glossed over in history a lot. But the Africans were actually, they would go out and capture people from rival groups that lived near them and then sell those people to the Europeans who were coming and exchange them for those goods that were listed right there. The Europeans, they stay right on the coast. It is very rare that any of these explorations that these people did here ever went inland into Africa. So that you can see that on this map really clearly, that all of this green outline, there's red and the red outlines here, all of this, you guys, they stayed right on the coast. They never go inland. So this is partly because they don't know what's there. Like, it's never been explored by the Europeans. They're a little bit nervous. They have no idea what the geography is like, what the people are like. So they're actually dealing with tribes right on the coast. Those tribes would go inland, but not the Europeans. They stayed right on the coast. So as you guys are working on this, you can go ahead and actually pause this so that you can take these notes here and write them down, so that you get all of this down. So let's talk about the African slave trade, because it is absolutely going to just explode. So it's something that is going to be obviously like a huge deal for our country, because the way that our country, the colonies and whatnot are formed, they really would thrive by having this. And so they realized that this was a moneymaker opportunity for sure. So if we look at the New World, so we're talking about the Caribbean and we are talking about America, for sure, there were some massive plantations. So let's talk about plantations. Plantations were these really large farming homesteads. So basically, you would have usually a very wealthy owner who owned the plantation. There are lots and lots of fields. And typically they're growing cotton and tobacco. Those are the two cash crops. Sugarcane is also a thing, particularly in the Caribbean. That was not grown in America, or what becomes America in the colonies at the time. But cotton and tobacco here, and then sugarcane was coming in from the Caribbean. So it takes a lot of labor to run these plantations. And as the slave trade is starting to expand and they're starting to bring Africans from Africa to the New World, what these plantation owners realized was that they could purchase the slaves, so they're buying people, who of course, they didn't really look at the Africans as being people, they were property, which is just crazy to think about. So they actually would purchase these slaves, and they realized that because they didn't have to pay them, right, they had to keep them alive, so they had to have some type of shelter and food, but free labor meant more profit for them, right? So this is how it's going to expand, and it's going to expand bigger and bigger and bigger until it will literally get to the point where the slaves that are in America are having children, and so now the plantation owners don't have to go buy new slaves because their slaves are literally having babies who will become the next generation of slaves. And that's why this is such a gigantic explosion, and just crazy how this works out. So work on the plantations varies depending on the slave's ability, really to be able to work. So a lot of times you found that the big strong men were doing work that required heavier lifting, if you will. Some of them worked inside of the homes. There are people who believe that that job was a little bit nicer of a job, but oftentimes there were other consequences that kind of came with that as well. And so it's just really a poor journey altogether. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail about the slave trade when we talk about the triangle trade later and how the goods were exchanged. But I wanted to make sure that you guys knew that this is how this is going to start. This is the reason why they were able to bring so many Africans to the New World, because there was such a demand for that free labor on the plantations. So what's going to happen is that the African rulers who had problems with other tribes, this is really key to know. In Africa, there's a lot of tribes that have not got along with each other for like thousands of years, which is the case all over the world, right? So they're going to continue to not get along with each other. So in this case, some of those rulers would send out their army or their marksmen, whoever's in charge of their military, capture slaves from the neighboring tribes that they don't get along with. They would then bring them from those inland villages out to the coast where the Europeans were at. They would exchange them for those textiles, like we talked about, the cotton and cloth. It says here metal works, so other things that involved metal. Rum, which is coming from the Caribbean. Tobacco, also grown in the New World. Weapons and gunpowder. So this is going to be a little bit different than when we talked about the Spanish with the natives. Because in this case, some of the African rulers are actually kind of in cahoots with the Europeans, and they are actually arming them with weapons and gunpowder and guns. This allows them, of course, to take over those other tribes and kidnap those people. Later on, though, this is going to become key when the Africans want to overthrow some of the Europeans, because they've actually been armed by the Europeans here. So that's sort of how this exchange is going to happen. So let's see. There is going to be one guy. His name is Afonso the First, and Afonso is the king of the Congo. This is in West Central Africa, so this is different than the Democratic Republic of the Congo that exists today, which is actually a country in Africa. So Afonso had actually been raised with tutors from Portugal. So as the Portuguese had sort of settled in this area, they were trying to convert like the Africans to Christianity. In this process, Afonso is going to get tutored by a Portuguese missionary who was there trying to convert them to Christianity. So he's going to become king in 1505, just to give you a time frame of where we are. And he basically called Portuguese government and he's like, hey, I need your help. I would like to turn my country into a Christian state. So, I know you guys are Christian. Can you come and help me do that? But I also would like to modernize our state a little bit more. Like, I want us to be more like you and less like the tribe that we were when you showed up. He really looked at this situation and he realized that there was a big, huge problem. Every year, more and more Portuguese traders were coming and buying slaves or trading for slaves. And he's like, at some point, like, are you going to start taking those of us who have these deals with you and we have alliances with you? Because you're going to run out eventually. Like, that's what his fear is. He basically wants to maintain that contact with Europe. He wants to become a modern Christian state in the Congo there, but he wants to end the slave trade. So he really is going to fight hard against that and try really hard to get the Portuguese government to work with him and stop trading for slaves in his country. In the long run, unfortunately for him, that's not going to happen. So he fights for that, but the Portuguese still continue to come. They really were making so much money off of these slaves that no matter how much he bugged them and tried to make those changes, there was no way that those Portuguese traders were ever going to give up on this, because they truly were just making so much money off of that trade. So even though Afonso tried really hard, that's not going to happen. He's not the last person who's going to try to stop the trade. But those rulers that come after him and in other parts of Africa, they're going to face the exact same thing in the end. The Portuguese are going to continue to come, and eventually so are the other countries, as the slave trade is going to expand more and more in the New World. And so unfortunately their efforts really fall on deaf ears, and the slave trade is going to continue.